Okay, so welcome to today's ZEF colloquium, and very warm welcome to our guest speaker, Mouayad Al-Samara. So Mouayad got his PhD from Sorbonne University in Paris, and after that he moved to Qatar University, where currently he works as associate professor. And today Mouayad will present his paper, The Impact of Socio-Economic Development and Political Instability on the Ecological Footprint in the MENA region. So Mouayad, the floor is yours. Please go ahead.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Zenita, for having me in this workshop, in this presentation. And thank you very much for giving me this opportunity to present my paper titled by the impact of socio-economic development and political instability on ecological footprint in MENA region. Actually, I have here some the main points that I'm going to present in this presentation. I will start with a general introduction, and then we have some brief discussion about the relationship between ecological footprint and human development index in the MENA. And then I'm going to move to some important literature about the topic. And briefly, I'm going to present the data that I used and the empirical methodology that we use in this paper. And finally, we will end by some empirical results, some important empirical results about this relationship for MENA region and some policy implication. Actually, this topic is very important for MENA regions because, as you know, the demand for the natural resources in the global as a whole has increased a lot during the last decades, which make huge challenges on the environment aspects, and this is resulting in severe challenges on this relationship between economic development and environment development at the same time. When we discuss this topic, it's very important to mention that this relationship is well discussed in the literature, and the EKC, or the environment constants curve hypothesis, presents an important window and important to see whether we can intervene at the policy implication in this relationship. And where this relationship is very important because it states that after a certain level of economic development, maybe we can affect this relationship, and we can increase the human development. At the same time, we can decrease the adverse impact on the environmental degradation in general. So this hypothesis, the EKC hypothesis, is very important, and it has some important implication, but still there's something to say about this issue. When we discover, or when we explore the literature, the empirical literature and the theoretical literature, we find that the most of the empirical studies have used the GDP per capita, with some very few exceptions. And here we are going to use an alternative indicator represented by the HDI, the Human Development Index. So in this paper, we are going to see whether we can improve the sustainable development by looking in two dimensions. The first one is the social dimension and the income dimension, and both of them, they are represented by the HDI. So we will use the Human Development Index here instead of the GDP per capita, and this will be a better combination between the socio and economic and how they can affect the environment and degradation in the MENA region. So we chose a large sample of Middle East and North Africa MENA region we select like 16 countries based on the data that are available for this region. And actually we use here this sample is very important because it's contain different two types of group of countries. The first one can be represented by the oil producing country and the non-oil producing country. And we are going to see whether the pathway of the sustainable development in these two different groups and in the sample as whole is different or not. So this is the most important thing. The second important thing here, we are looking into this relationship between environment and development in the MENA region in the light of the recent structural events that we have in this region, in these countries, especially after the 2011 uprising and the political instability that we have seen in the region. So this could be an important motivation for our study. And by having the ecological footprint, the Human Development Index, and focusing on the political instability in the MENA region, we want to address the following question. The first question is related to the shape and the characteristics of the relationship between HDI, Human Development Index, and the ecological footprint in the MENA countries. And this is very important because the pathway could be different when we discuss the oil producing countries and the non-oil producing countries. When we discuss the difference between high level income and low level income, and both these subgroups are included in our sample. Secondly, we want to focus on the impact of the conflict that witnessed after 2011 in some Arab regions like Egypt, Tunisia, Syria, Yemen. All these countries are very important in our samples and represents a part which we want to discover here and to account for this structural changes by, in this case, we called it by the political instability in the region, and how the picture, the full picture will be impacted by this political instability. So we will take the structure break in 2011 into consideration in our estimation. And the last motivation here that we have, we want to look at the pathway, how the ecological footprint or the environmental enhancement will be affected by the shocks that could be happen for the HDI or the Human Development Index. And to do so, actually, we have this preliminary analysis for the relationship between the EF or the ecological footprint and the HDI. And you can see here we have just like 4 snapshots in 1990, 2000, 2010, and 2016. And you can see how the evolution of the HDI in these sample, in the full sample. This graph is very important, and from here we get the idea that there's something important when you look at this graph. We can see that there's an increase from period to period. When we compare 2010 with 2016 here, 2010 and 2016, we can see that the picture to some extent it's the same, and that's because of some countries has witnessed the political instability, such as Egypt, Tunisia, for some other countries, Jordania and Algeria. Another MENA countries have experienced a substantial decline in their level of HDI, and this is can be seen here in 2016, and this is actually, it's related for those are affected by the conflict, and most of them, they are non-oil countries. And finally, we can see that the common trend for this development, there's a kind of increasing, there's a positive relationship between ecological footprint and the HDI as a general. We did this exercise again for the sample as a whole, and we studied the relationship between the average of the HDI and the changes of the ecological footprint, and we got this interesting graph. This interesting graph saying that for non-oil countries, on average, lower HDI, and at the same time, there's a lower ecological footprint or changes in the ecological footprint. And this is correct for many, many countries, such as Sudan, Yemen, Syria, Egypt to some extent. But again, this figure, it's very important, and it's clearly show that the percentage changes in the ecological footprints when there is an increase in this HDI, there is an increase in the ecological footprint. But the threshold here, it's 0.75, as you can see. After this level, some countries like Qatar, Bahrain, United Arab Emirates start to have a downward sloping. That's mean when they increase their HDI, the changes in the ecological footprint is decreasing. So this is just the general picture for our analysis for these 16 countries. And it's clearly shown that the pathway to more sustainable development is different between these countries. And that's why in our analysis, we focus on the full sample, non-oil countries and oil countries. And of course, the non-oil countries represents the lower income countries in this situation. So we started from the nominant paper of Grossman and Groger that he provided the concept of the EKC that developed in 1556. And this important framework is very useful in our analysis just to see for these countries, the oil producing countries in the MENA region, whether they have this the inverted U shape. I mean, after a certain level of an increasing in per capita income per capita, whether they be able to decrease the environmental damage. So we apply this hypothesis here for our sample, and we've got some important results. Here, just the literature view. That's what I want to say from this table, that we explore like 100 papers in this area, and we found that only very few paper that use the ecological footprint as a measure for the environmental degradation. And at the same time, very few papers that use the HDI, the Human Development Index, as a measure for the social and the economic dimensions at the same time. That's why we decide to use both of them in our analysis, and which is not exist for the MENA regions so far. So in general, we will use the HDI instead of the real GDP per capita, and we will use the ecological footprint indicator here instead of the CO2 emission. Ecological footprint, it's a broad indicator, which is consists many or like 4 dimensions, covered the income per capita, the education level, the health level, etc. That's why HDI here could be more useful for our analysis. The data that we use to build up our model actually is like this. We use the ecological footprint, and it's represented by the measure for the assets needed to produce natural resources in a certain country. The HDI, the Human Development Index, which is an index between 0 and 1, and the average for the region, it's like 0.74. We use, following the literature, another explanatory variables such as energy consumption, trade, urbanization, etc. And actually here we discuss in this table the expected impact on the ecological footprint following the literature, and we will see how our analyses are fitting with these expected signs here in this table. So to investigate this relationship between EF, ecological footprint, and HDI, Human Development Index, in the MENA region, actually we follow two different methodologies. The first one is the Panel VAR, Panel Vector Autoregressive analysis, and we follow the FLMOs or the to test and investigate the EKC hypothesis. Why we use the Panel VAR? It's very important here and has some characteristics. First of all, it tackles any problems related to small time series data, since the data which is available for MENA regions only from 1990 to 2016. At the same time, PVAR take into consideration the heterogeneous problem that could be raised in our panel estimation. The PVAR at the same time can be considered as a system equation where all variables could be indigenous. In this estimation, also the PVAR will be very useful to get the inverse responses function, which will be represented by the pathway of development in these countries. As we mentioned before, we applied for the subsample oil countries and non-oil countries. So the inverse responses function that we get from the PVAR, it's very important, and it will provide an initial picture about the relationship between social and economic development and the ecological footprint in the region. Here we have the main estimation of our Panel VAR, and actually I here focused on the impact of the HDI on the EF. You can see that the impact in the full sample is a negative, -5.7. For oil-producing countries, they have a larger impact, it's negative again, but for non-oil countries, it's still lower impact, but it's a positive impact. This is a very important result because here we can say that for the full sample, there is a negative relationship between HDI and ecological footprint. More HDI, higher level of HDI will affect the ecological footprint negatively, and this is a significant result. At the same time, when we look at the non-oil countries here, the impact is positive, which is very important to differentiate in our sample between those higher income and lower income or oil producing countries. Here we have two problems for these countries. They are higher income countries, and at the same time they are depend on the one resources. They have entitlement of natural resources, and this is very important, and we focus on this issue in our analysis. When we look at the inverse responses function, we can see here, this is the picture for the full sample. You can see here the response of the ecological footprint in MENA region for one standard deviation shock in the Human Development Index. So the initial impact is negative here, and it's followed by a positive impact. And at least here in 1 year, we have a negative impact in the response of the ecological footprint in HDI. And here it's a stable VAR because this shock will start to die out after maybe 3 years in this situation. So this picture, it's the full sample, and it's confirmed the negative impact of HDI on the ecological footprint. When we divide the sample into oil-producing countries and non-oil-producing countries, we can see here for the oil-producing countries, the picture it's similar to some extent. the initial impact is negative, followed by the positive impact, and then the impact start to die out in the long term. The picture for the non-oil producing country, the lower income countries here, is completely different, and you can see that there is a positive, the initial impact here for of HDI on the ecological footprint is positive and start to die, decrease gradually, and then die out in the long term. So these interesting results could be very important for policymakers in the MENA region, especially when we talk about the different level of human development indicator in these countries. The most important part of our paper that we want to see whether this relationship has a threshold after a certain level of income. So to do so, we follow the FMOLOS regression analysis to see whether the EKC hypothesis is valid here in our sample, and we follow the same strategy by have 3 different analyses for the full sample for the oil producing country and the non-oil producing country. So we estimate 2 different models, 2 different equations. The first one is a simple one, which is investigate the relationship between the HDI and the square of the HDI to discover whether we have a nonlinear relationship. And this nonlinear relationship could be even assigned from the impulse responses function that we have a negative impact and then followed by the positive impact. So this is an indicator that maybe we have a nonlinear impact when we consider the relationship between HDI and EF. The augmented model here, the second equation represents the augmented model when we include a dummy for 2011 that capture the political instability in the region. So we redo our estimation by having a dummy variable in 2011, and we have 2 components here, which represents the interaction factors between this structure break of 2011 and the Human Development Index. So our analysis here, it's very important and provide an interesting result. When we consider the full sample here, you can see that the impact is negative in the first model here. And the turning point when we calculated by having minus beta 1 over 2 beta 2 here, if you look at this equation here, the first equation, minus alpha 1 over 2 alpha 2, it will be give the turning point. So in general, the turning point is 0.164. That's mean after HDI level equal to 0.164, maybe the impact will be positive on the ecological footprint. Again, when we consider the second equation here, and we consider the uprising, the turning point is different. We need more Human Development Index. It could be 0.77 before the without adding the impact of 2011. And when we add the impact of 2011 and recalculate the turning point, the level will be 0.88. So this interesting results tell us that we need to invest more in the HDI to reach the level that maybe start to regain the benefits of the human development, social and economic development on the ecological footprint. So when we consider the political instability, we need more investigation in this developments, the human and social developments. We recalculate the estimation for the 2 subsamples. Here in the second, in the white column here, we have the oil-producing countries. Again, you can see for oil-producing countries, the level is much higher, 0.76. This is the threshold level of the Human Development Index. When we take into account the impact of 2011, there is the impact, it's not very clear. We have the same to some extent, but remember that the changes in the Human Development Index is very, very trivial and very small. And again, when we consider the total impact, when we add the impact of political instability, the level even for the oil producing country is much higher. It's 0.85. The picture for the non-oil countries, it's completely different. The turning point could be at 0.68. And when we account for the political instability of 2011, this will be much lower, 0.66. But when we have the total impact on the ecological footprint, the impact will be 0.70. Here I put just the average of the HDI, just to know where we were now. So if the average of the HDI for the sample, it's 0.7, and because of the political instability in the region, we need a threshold level equal to 0.88. That means the political instability delay the period, the years that we need to reach this turning point. The same scenario here for the oil producing countries. It's 0.79, whereas when we take the total impact of the political instability, the turning point will be 0.85. The same can be here for the non-oil countries. So this is very important just to shed the light on the political instability to what extent it's affect the level of the relationship between HDI and the ecological footprint. Now we need more development in terms of economic development, social developments to reach this level, which is 0.88, to start regain the benefits of the EKC hypothesis. So before we need only 0.64, and now we need 0.88, and this is a huge difference because of the political instability in the region. So this is what I mentioned before on the relationship between the ecological footprint and HDI. Finally, I will conclude with this some policy implication. So in general, our results reveal that ecological footprint is strongly impacted by the level of HDI. There is a strong relationship between EF and HDI, and policymakers are more likely to achieve a sustainable development when the HDI improves. And we need a large improvement of the HDI to achieve the sustainable development even in oil-producing countries. We show that there exists an inverse relationship between EF and HDI. The EKC is valid, and this is very important for the policymakers, that there is a window of hope where we can intervene to attain beyond a certain level of HDI, the turning point, without have a diverse impact on the environment. We also find that other factors like can be impact the environmental here, the ecological footprint, such as trade, energy consumption, and this can be seen from the FMO's estimation. But since our estimation is focusing, I here focus on the HDI. But of course, other factors, other variables like trade, energy consumptions, and urbanization has an important role to achieve this relationship. Our study reveals that improving HDI is a valuable tool for policymakers to go a step forward in sustainable development. And finally, the political instability in 2000 that started in 2011 affect this relationship. The level now is completely different, and we are talking about different threshold level exists in the region. because of this conflict, of this political instability, and its spillover impacts even in this political instability in the non-oil countries, but its spillover impacts on the region as a whole. And we are talking now about a higher level of HDI to start experience environment improvement as a whole. So in general, we can say that political instability may therefore jeopardize the efforts of country to attain a sustainable development goals. And we see this when we talk about the turning point is moving from 0.75 to 0.88. This is a large increase in HDI to attain the gains of the environment or the environment improvements in the region. Thank you very much. This is a brief presentation about my paper, the impact of socio-economic developments on the ecological footprint in MENA region. Thank you very much. If there's any questions, any comments, I hope I will be able to answer your questions and your comments.
Thank you very much, Muyad. I think it was a very relevant presentation for all of us here at ZEF. First of all, I think we don't do so much research on MENA region, so that's a very interesting insight for us. And the second point is obviously the importance of this relationship between development and environment. And we also have quite a number of researchers working at ZEF who are interested in this kind of topics. So I hope we will have quite a lot of comments today. So we can now open the floor for the discussion. If you have any questions or comments or suggestions to Muyad, you can either raise your hand or use the chat function. Maybe before the public moves on, have you tried also how your results would look like if you really use this GDP like the literature usually does, and how your results using HDI compare to the use of GDP? Is it really making a difference?
Yeah, actually we start our estimation by using GDP. And when you look at the level of the GDP, is completely different between these countries. And for some countries, even the data is not available. For example, in Syria, the data for GDP is not reliable. It's not available since 2010. For Iraq, for Yemen, for many countries. And actually, when we run our analysis to get basically the impulse response function, we didn't get any stability in our VAR. And we didn't complete our estimation when we find this results when we use the real GDP per capita. Maybe the variation between the data between the countries were very high, and it gives this let us say insignificant results or unreliable results. Then we think why we didn't use another indicator for the economic development, and then we chose the HDI. This is the reason. To be honest, we tried the GDP, but we didn't get any significant results to the even CO2 or the ecological footprint.
Mm-hmm. And do you think it's just a question of quality of data, or maybe there is some conceptual difference as well? Why you can exactly prefer to use HDI?
Yeah, there's some differences even in when we talk about the level of the income in these countries. Maybe the quality of data as well. It's very important, because the data, when we have the data of the real GDP for some countries in the region, it wasn't reflect the other developments in the other countries in the region. Maybe there's some I don't know exactly, but we couldn't find any significant results when we intervene with real GDP or real GDP per capita for these countries.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you, Muyat. I see there is another question from Fatima. Fatima, please.
Yeah, thank you for the nice presentation. It was really amazing. And I have a couple questions. First of all, I want the link for your paper to read the full paper. And second, if I understand correctly, is the main result of your research that the more high HDI, the less this will affect negatively in the ecological footprint, or positively. I get confused a little bit. And the second option is regarding the MENA region. I'm coming from Sudan, and it is least developing country, but they produce the oil. So, and how this comparison to the like Saudi Arabia, Qatar, they are producing country, but they have high HDI comparing to the Sudan. So is it, I in the graph, I see always like my country will be in the column with a non-oil country, but in the same time, it is a country where they produce oil. So I don't know what do you, I'm
Okay.
just, yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much, Fatima. Should I answer?
Yes, please go ahead.
Okay. Thank you very much, Fatima, for your question. To be honest with you, there's a lot of estimation, but in general, the relationship between HDI and ecological footprint is negative for the full sample, and for the oil producing country is negative relationship. For the other countries, let us say Egypt, Tunisia, Algeria, Morocco, Yemen, Syria, Lebanon, etc., it's a positive relationship. That means in these countries, if we increase the level of the human development, we will have more demand on the natural resources, on the ecological footprint. But for the other countries, the relationship is negative in the sense that they are now located on the second stage. When we increase economic development, the environment degradation will be lower. So we have the two results in our estimation. Both of them, they are there. And that's why we differentiate between oil and non-oil countries in this analysis. For the full sample, the picture is completely different from the non-oil countries. But our main findings here that if we want to have this negative relationship between economic development and environment degradation, before Arab uprising in 2011, it's enough to have 0.75 as HDI index. Now we are talking about 0.88 because of the conflict, because of the political instability. Now we need more HDI level, higher HDI level, to reach the same threshold level where we can gain from this negative relationship between HDI and ecological footprint. This is for the first question. For the second question, yeah, I fully agree with you. We have many of other countries like Sudan, like even Syria before 2011, we produce oil. But when we compare the main participation in the real GDP in these countries, we can find that Gulf countries are the main oil exporting countries in the region here, because the share of the oil production in the real GDP is relatively very high compared to Syria and Sudan or other countries. Even Algeria, it's among these countries. But when you see the graph that we have it here in the beginning, actually this was the most important graph in our analysis. Here you can see that you have all the countries, and some of them like Iran, Libya, Algeria, they are producing countries, but they are still in the first stage of economic development, where more economic development need more environmental degradation. But other countries, like mainly Gulf countries, Saudi, Qatar, Bahrain, United Arab Emirates, they start to be located here in the second stage of this graph, where more economic development here. This is the HDI. When we increase HDI here, the ecological footprint now it starts to decrease. So we have completely different relationship when we talk about these 4 countries.
Thank you, Muyad.
So sorry, just to understand.
Please go ahead.
Consider the Sudan as an oil country. That is, I mean, in your analysis, you analyze only the Gulf state as an oil producing country, as a oil countries, and the others are non-oil producing country, right? If I understand correctly.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, makes sense. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Fatima. Andre, please.
Thank you, Zaneta. It's just a quick question. Thank you for your presentation. It was quite interesting. I see that in your ecological footprint index, it captures only land. I can see that the unit is hectares. But if you'd make a more comprehensive index involving, for example, water, would you think that the results change a bit, or do you think it would be robust? Maybe you don't have data for that, but it's just something to think about to make the index a bit more comprehensive. That's it. Thanks.
Yeah. Thank you very much. This is an interesting question. Actually, the index that we use, it's the ecological footprint. It's the only comprehensive index that exists on which is better than the CO2 emission. CO2 emission and SO2 emission are included in this index. But for the demand on the water, I don't know whether the details of this index are included. Of course, it could be a very important, idea if we can have the same index, but related to the demand of the human demand for water are included. Yeah, I don't know. I will see if there is another indicator represented by the ecological footprint. Include the water demand, that will be great. Yeah.
Thank you, Eugenia.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you so much for your presentation. Yeah, actually, my question is also goes into the direction of ecological footprint indicator. Because as you showed, the majority of studies used CO2 and not this ecological footprint indicator. And as far as I know, there is a lot of critique about composition of the ecological footprint indicator, because it aggregates completely different environmental categories into one index, and the aggregation methodology is sometimes not very transparent. And especially that it doesn't include, for example, non-CO2 emissions in its structure, and a wide range of non-renewable resources, emissions, and environmental impacts are not covered. And especially it has a lot of critique how trade flows, like import and export, are treated in this aid indicator. And for example, you in your paper also, as I understand, analyzes the impact of trade on this environmental footprint. So the question is, are you maybe going to try to replicate the result with some other indicator, just CO2 from input-output analysis for the whole region, to see whether the results will be like in the same directions? Because still this ecological footprint is like highly criticized, and especially like for the trade. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Eugenia. And let me just tell you that Eugenia has been working on these issues, and probably she would be a good source also to, to give you some ideas.
Yeah. Thank you, Eugenia, for your comments, your question. To be honest, that we use the ecological footprint because we find that the majority of the empirical estimation used the CO2. And as you know, CO2 is just capture a partial part of the environment degradation. So the main motivation here to use the ecological footprint just because we think about the ecological footprint as a broad indicator that could be reflect the environment degradation more than the CO2. Of course, if we, it will be, a great idea if we can replicate the same data using the CO2. We did it for Qatar, actually, and we published this paper in Energy Sustainable Review. We did it only for one country. We used the ecological footprint and CO2, and we've got for one country different results. This is the reality. There is no inverted U shape when we use CO2 for Qatar, but when we use ecological footprint, there is a U shape. That means the EKC hypothesis is valid. Yeah, I fully agree with you. Maybe if we use both of them, then we can be quite sure whether these criticizes for the ecological footprint is valid or not. I didn't investigate a lot about how they use the ecological footprint and the methodology beyond it, but I feel that it's still an interested indicator and we use it. But of course, it will be interesting if we can replicate it and we use an alternative, which is the CO2. But again, when we did it for some Gulf countries, I think there's another publication for Saudi Arabia, for Emirates. They didn't find any EKC hypothesis valid for these countries when they used the CO2. Maybe this is the results which is more close to the reality, because we saw in these countries there is a lot of demand on the natural resources, water, land, seas. As one of your colleagues sent to me, the building of these artificial lands. That's mean still the development process in this region is still there is a positive relationship when we look at the reality and when we look at the demand of the human demand on the natural resources as a whole. But here, when we use the ecological footprint, we find that some of these countries like Qatar, Bahrain, even it's a negative relationship when we take United Arab Emirates. So that's mean in United Arab Emirates, there's an now the changes in the environment degradation is negative, which is a big achievement if the data is correct and if the ecological footprint indicator is a more valid indicator. Yeah, it's a very valid point, and maybe we will take it into consideration in a future work.
Thank you, Muyat. We have some comments in the chat, but maybe before I read them, I will give the floor to Janos.
I have a clarification question, and apologies if you covered this and I missed it. It relates to this figure 2 and the interpretation where you say this upward pattern reverts back when the average HDI is 0.75. Looking at Saudi Arabia and Qatar, they're still the top two kind of like in terms of average year percentage change. So I'm just wondering if we took out the fit or the moderate slope, then I think the picture is more ambiguous. I'm wondering if there's additional evidence that led you to this conclusion, Is it looking at Bahrain and UAE? Yes, that seems to be the case, but that might also just because they had high footprint before, and so the reduction there is more drastic. So can you elaborate a little bit on this pattern that reverts back after the 0.75 point?
Thank you. Muyad?
Thank you very much. If I understand you very well, you mean if we exclude Saudi Arabia from our sample and we look at the impact of Saudi Arabia alone and the rest? This is your question?
No, sorry. I have trouble understanding the graph with the interpretation where it says the upward pattern, so the higher percentage change in EF reverts when the average HDI is above 0.75. Saudi Arabia and Qatar are both above 0.75 and have the highest year-on-year percentage change in environmental footprint.
Yeah, I fully agree with you. But here when we look at the data, when we look at the percentage changes in the ecological footprint, here we take the average, but the percentage changes for the ecological footprint for Saudi Arabia and Qatar and Bahrain is lower compared, to the other countries. For example, here Iran, Algeria, Turkey, Egypt. And it's a negative changes when we take United Arab Emirates. Because in this line, we take into consideration the changes, the yearly changes, and the data that we have that in details. Saudi Arabia now have a lower changes compared to these countries here. Even Qatar, they have lower changes compared to these countries here. But here we present the average of the yearly changes and the average of the HDI. Yeah, maybe there's something which is lead to this misleading, but what we want to say, this graph is complement to this one. When we look at the different spots and different years, you can see that the general behavior, there is an increase in the HDI and an increase in the ecological footprint. But when we consider the changes here, we've got this graph and the changes in the Excel sheet. What I mean for Saudi Arabia and Qatar and Bahrain was lower compared to the other countries here in this stage.
Perfect, thank you.
I hope I answered your question.
Okay, good. We have still 6 minutes left, so let me maybe turn to the 2 chat questions. Let me read them out. First is from Isaac, who says it will be interesting for policymakers to understand which aspects of human development are most relevant for environmental sustainability. Do you have any ideas on these pathways? Do you want to answer this? Or I should follow with the second question?
Actually, we don't get into these details, actually, in which aspects, whether they have to focus on education, human rights, health system. We don't go in this because actually we don't have the details of the HDI. If we have the 4 aspects of the HDI and then we regress the ecological footprint on the details of the HDI, then we can get more policy implications about the component of the HDI itself.
Mm-hmm. Maybe that could be a good idea, and certainly you can get.
A good idea,
Okay, and the last question is from Abdul Rashid. And Abdul Rashid says some oil-rich countries, especially Saudi Arabia, are currently significantly decoupling their economies from oil and investing in solar and negative emissions technologies. Have you taken that into consideration? How would that affect your results in the short term?
Yeah, this is true for some countries like Saudi Arabia and United Arab Emirates, even Qatar. But this has started just recently, and the data that are available about ecological footprint only for 2016. I don't know whether there's data after 2016. If we get this data and we extend our analysis for 2020, maybe we will consider these things into consideration. Maybe we will see that some of these countries like Emirates, Saudi Arabia, or Qatar start to diversify their economies and depend more on non-oil production by for example, solar productions, another kind of activity to minimize the CO2 emission. But so far, the data that we use it and that we have for 2016, and it gives us this results. For sure, if we get data for 2020, the picture maybe will be different, because after 2016, we still have 3 important events. We are talking about the sharp decrease in oil production. We are talking about the economic blockade and the political intention among the Gulf countries, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, etc., etc. And we are talking about the recent crisis represented by the COVID-19. These factors together, for sure, will affect the shape of the relationship between HDI and ecological footprint in the MENA countries.
Great, thank you, Muyad. Maybe last question, because even before this presentation, we had some comments from Dario. Dario, do you still want to add something or ask something, or you are satisfied?
Yeah, thanks for getting back to that. Actually, he already talked a little bit about that these impacts on, for example, soil or sand disappearance in the Pacific that are produced by crazy island building in some of these countries are definitely not sustainable, and of course the ecological footprint does not include them. My question was rather whether missing out on these dimensions, on these ecologically important dimensions, has implications that would change the policy directions that you would recommend. So, I mean, right now, the environmental Kuznets curve is basically an argument pro-development, pro-growth, yeah? And if we would consider other ecological dimensions and it would change the direction, maybe the argument would go into the opposite direction.
Thank you, Dario.
Thank you, Dario. Thank you very much. Yeah, for sure. Again, what I want to say that this is the result that I have from the data and the indicator that are available. And I mentioned before, when we look at the ground here, and I live in this region to some extent, at least in the last 6 years. Yeah, you feel that to some extent the data telling us something different from what we have on the ground, because maybe, as you mentioned, all of you, that the ecological footprint has received a lot of criticisms in the literature. But again, what we have in the literature, we have that there's a valid Constance curve when we talk about CO2 and real GDP, which is not true. I mean, we couldn't consider that an increase in the real GDP per capita will benefit the economic, the environmental degradation. That's why we move forward and we pick up another indicator that to some extent more broad compared to the CO2, and we have this results. Of course, if we got another indicator or data related to another activities, as I mentioned before, for I think for you, Dario, thank you for your email that you sent it to me. I don't know whether this data about how much they demand for when they make these artificial islands, when make these huge buildings in these countries compared to this. But in general, this is the data that we have. Even the CO2 that we measured, for example, in Qatar and Saudi Arabia, we don't know whether this CO2 is this is the CO2 emission from one country, but at the end, maybe the CO2 that exists in one region, it's caused by another region or by another country. So this is what the indicator tell us. And of course, if we get more detailed data, the picture will be changed. But how it will be changed for a better picture or worse picture, I don't know.
Okay, thank you. And yes, I probably would agree that it might be interesting to also include, to the extent possible, some international aspects between different countries and how development in one country can also affect environmental degradation in neighboring countries or other countries, as is the case of oil exporting countries, probably. So maybe that's the future research. Anyway, thank you so much, Muyat, for your presentation. We were very happy to have you here. Thank you, all of you, for your participation and your questions and suggestions. So if you want to get in touch with Muyat, you could easily find him. And yeah, we encourage you to discuss any other remaining issues with Muyat directly. So thank you again, and see you next week. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much. Thank you.